Montana Territory, 1878. The first time Marshal Merritt Harlan saw the woman in chains, the snow had just started falling over the Bitterroot Mountains. She stood barefoot in the back of a prison wagon, wrists shackled and face smeared with dirt, but her eyes wide, unblinking, and burning with defiance were the kind that didn't break easy. She was no outlaw. Merritt had seen enough real criminals to know the difference. Something in his gut twisted when he looked at her. The wagon rolled into the mining town of Calver's Fork just after sundown, pulled by 2 tired horses and an even more tired deputy from Helena. Merritt had been fixing the hinges on the jailhouse door when it arrived. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his coat, and stepped into the street. The deputy dismounted. "Prisoner transport to Helena went sideways," he said. "3 dead. She's the only one we got left." Merritt's gaze locked on the woman's. "What's she charged with?" "Stealing from a U.S. officer. Assault. Maybe murder," the deputy muttered. "Apache sympathizer," they said. The woman didn't speak. She just stood there, her back straight like she still had some kind of pride left, even with the iron around her bones. "What's your name?" Merritt asked her. She looked him in the eye. "Delaney Rose." Something in him jolted. He had not heard that name in 13 years. Delaney Rose Riverton. She used to climb the apple trees behind his father's cabin when they were kids, barefoot and laughing, wild as the wind. He remembered the way she used to braid green twigs into her hair, the way she dared him to leap off the barn roof into the haystack. Then one season she was gone. Her family had packed up without a word. He never saw her again. Until now. Her face had changed, of course. Older. Sharper. But those eyes were the same. Stormy gray, like the sky before a blizzard. Merritt's chest tightened. "Get her down from there," he said. The deputy frowned. "You sure? Now." He helped her to the ground himself. Her ankles were bleeding from the irons. She didn't flinch when he touched her, but she didn't look at him either. Merritt turned to the deputy. "Leave her with me tonight. You ride back in the morning. I want to talk to her before she gets dragged to Helena." The deputy looked unsure but finally nodded. "She's your problem now." Merritt led Delaney into the jailhouse. He didn't put her in a cell. Instead, he sat her down at the table by the stove, poured her a mug of coffee, and cut the chains from her wrists. She didn't say a word the whole time. Only when he handed her the cup did she finally speak. "You should have let them hang me." He stared at her. "Why would I do that? I am not the girl you remembered. I remember you stole my hat and threw it in the creek. And I remember you laughed so hard you fell in after it." She looked down. Her hands trembled. "I did not steal from that officer," she whispered. "He tried to buy me. I said no, so he took what he could." Merritt felt a chill run down his spine. "And the others?" he asked. "I ran. I did not kill them." He believed her. Without needing proof, without needing time. He just did. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "No one's hanging you." Delaney stared at him like he was mad. "You cannot save everyone, Merritt." "I know," he said. "But I can save you." That night, he gave her his own bed and slept in the chair by the stove. She didn't protest, but she didn't thank him either. The next morning, the deputy rode out without her. The town didn't ask questions. Merritt had earned enough trust to do as he saw fit. And he saw fit to protect her no matter what it cost. Over the next days, she barely spoke, but she did not run. She helped around the jail, cleaned what needed cleaning, and stayed out of trouble. Folks stared, of course. A woman like her, tall, proud, with scars she did not hide, did not go unnoticed in a place like Calver's Fork. One afternoon, he found her out back, splitting kindling in the snow. "You do not have to work," he said. "I need to do something with my hands," she answered. "Sitting makes my mind worse." He nodded and said nothing else. They fell into a rhythm. She cooked. He hauled water. She mended his shirts. He taught her how to shoot, though she already knew. She was better than him with a rifle, and he said so. She laughed. The first real sound of joy he had heard from her. He did not ask about where she had been all those years. Not yet. But one evening, when the sun was low and the sky was gold behind the mountains, Delaney sat beside him on the porch and spoke. "I was taken," she said, "near Fort Custer. They thought I was Comanche or Apache. I do not know. I was passed from man to man until I was not a person anymore." Merritt said nothing, but his fists clenched. "I escaped, lived with a Chiricahua family for a time. They treated me better than any white man ever had. Taught me to ride, to fight, to live again. And now they want to hang you for it," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." He turned to her slowly. "You are not going anywhere." Her jaw clenched. "You cannot protect me forever." "I can try." Her breath caught. She stood then, trembling. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I cannot stop thinking about you. Because I used to dream about you climbing apple trees and laughing. Because I look at you now and I still see something worth saving." Delaney stepped closer. "I am not who I was," she whispered. "I am not soft. I am not gentle. I have done things." "So have I," Merritt said. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. The next morning, snow blanketed the porch. Merritt woke to the smell of bread baking. Delaney stood at the stove, her hair pulled back, her face calm. "I want to stay," she said without turning. "If you will have me." Merritt crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind. She leaned into him, just a little. "I want nothing more," he whispered. And for the first time since he had left the war behind, since the ghosts had followed him home, Merritt Harlan felt something like peace. He had freed a woman in chains, and she was opening his wounded spirit to a love he never thought possible. The thaw came late that year. For weeks, spring hesitated on the edges of the valley, caught between the last snowmelt and the stubborn chill of the mountains. Calver's Fork stirred slowly with its wagons rutted the muddy roads again. Smoke drifted from chimneys longer in the mornings, and the saloon piano played late into the dusks. Delaney began working in the back room of the general store, sorting shipments and cataloging supplies for Mrs. Albright, who'd lost 2 sons to fever and had no mind left for numbers. It was quiet work, and it kept her out of the way of questions. Merritt walked her there each morning, not because she needed guarding, she'd made it clear she wouldn't be handled, but because she didn't refuse his presence. One afternoon, after the sun had burned off most of the cloud cover, Merritt found her leaning against the side of the barn behind the jailhouse, sleeves rolled high, stitching a tear in the canvas that covered the feed barrels. A crow called from somewhere distant. She didn't look up when he approached, just tied off her thread and sat back on her heels. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" "Being gone. No law. No town. Just sky and ground and what you could carry." She rested her forearms on her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the ridge lines met. "I miss the quiet," she said. "Not the running, not the hunger, but the kind of quiet that comes when no one expects anything from you. No explaining. No pretending to be made of softer things." Merritt crouched beside her. "You don't pretend much now." "That's because you don't ask me to." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the canvas she'd mended, straightened it, and tied it down with a firm knot. "They'll come looking," she said after a long silence. "Men like that don't quit just because a winter storm covered their tracks. They'll find I don't quit either. I don't want you to take a bullet meant for me. I've taken worse for less reason." She turned then, studying his profile. "You ever think about leaving all this? The badge, the jail, the weight of it?" He considered that. "Sometimes. But it's what I know. What I'm good at." "What else are you good at?" He gave her a look that held no jest, only quiet certainty. "Keeping you safe." Delaney's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way he said it. Like a vow made to no one but the earth beneath them. That evening, she didn't go back to her room in the loft. She stayed in the main house, barefoot on the wooden floor, her hair still damp from washing it. She stood by the stove, watching the kettle steam, not speaking. Merritt lit the lantern and set it gently on the table. You don't have to stay down here. I know. I want to. He moved toward her, slow, like one might approach a skittish horse. She didn't step back. I don't have much to offer, Delaney, he said. No land. No legacy. Just this town and the parts of it I try to hold together. She lifted her eyes to his. I don't want land. I want someone who doesn't flinch at what I've lived through. I don't flinch. No, she said. You don't. He cupped her cheek then, the first time he had touched her like that, and her eyes drifted closed as if his hand had given her permission to rest. She leaned into him, not with urgency but with a kind of surrender born from long resistance. He pressed his forehead to hers and neither of them spoke for a long time. Later, after the stove had burned down to glowing coals and the wind had stilled outside, Merritt lay with her in his arms, the space between them gone. She traced the scar along his ribs with her fingertips. Where did this come from? She whispered. Shiloh. Bayonet. She pressed her mouth softly to the mark, not out of pity, but in reverence for what it had cost. I wish I'd known you then, she said. He shook his head. You wouldn't have liked me. You don't know that. I do. I hated everything, especially myself. Delaney laid a hand over his heart. I would have sat with you anyway. He pulled her closer, wrapped his arm around her waist, and held on. In the days that followed, folks in town began to shift their tone. No one said much, but the way they nodded to her when she passed, the way Mrs. Albright sent her home with extra flower things were changing. Merritt noticed it too. He said nothing of it to her. But one night, as they sat on the stoop watching the stars blink into the velvet sky, she said, You did this. He turned to her. Did what? Made space for me. He shook his head. You did that yourself. I just stood still long enough to watch it happen. She smiled not with her mouth, but with her whole face, softened by something she hadn't let herself feel in years. She took his hand and interlaced her fingers with his. This is the first place I've ever felt like I could stay. Merritt brought her hand to his lips. Then stay. And she did. By early May, the hills beyond Calver's Fork had turned soft and green, and the cottonwoods along the creek were leafing out in pale gold. The first calves bawled from the open range west of town, and the river ran high with meltwater, thick with silt and broken limbs. Merritt had taken to riding the outer edge of the valley each morning, checking the trails for signs of movement. Not many passed through this early in the season, but the memory of what might still be hunting Delaney made him wary. He never said that aloud. She knew without him needing to. One evening, after a long day spent hauling timber for a cabin going up east of the church, he came through the jailhouse door to find her sorting a stack of maps on the desk. She had stripped off her boots and rolled her trousers to the knee, her feet tucked under the chair as though she'd forgotten anything existed outside the table's edge. Whose maps? Merritt asked, brushing mud from his sleeves. Yours, she said without looking up. Tucked behind a drawer. I was chasing a mouse. He moved closer. She had laid 3 of them flat, each brittle with age-old surveyor's ink, faded county borders, creases worn nearly through. I didn't know I had those. I figured you didn't. She tapped a faded line that ran along the west edge of the valley. This trail here, it cuts through Crowland. You ever ride it? Once. Years ago. It's rough going. She nodded. Better than I remember. You've been out that way? I had to be, she said, folding the map again. There was a time when the safest way through a county was to not be seen in it. He leaned against the wall, watching her hands. You thinking of going somewhere? No, she said. Just trying to see the shape of the land again. It's strange, staying in one place. My feet itch, but not in a way that means I want to run. He stepped closer, hands at his sides. Then what does it mean? I think it means I want something solid under me. Something that won't vanish when the snow comes. They stood like that for a while, no words between them. The wind outside caught the edge of the shutters and rattled them softly, like something old trying to get in. Later, As they sat beside the hearth and shared a plate of warm beans and cornbread, Delaney pushed her cup aside and asked, "What did you want before all this?" He looked over at her, surprised. "Before what?" "Before the war. Before the badge. Before the world broke open." He thought a long time before answering. "I wanted a horse of my own, a place I didn't have to leave, and a woman who didn't need saving, just someone to stand beside her." She nodded once. "I wanted to see the desert in bloom. I used to dream about that when I was small. Prickly pear, saguaro, all of it." "You ever get to?" "Not in the way I imagined." He didn't push further. She never offered more than she meant to. After the fire had burned low and the night pressed in around the windows, Delaney reached for his hand under the table. Her fingers were calloused and warm. She didn't speak, but her grip was steady, and Merritt closed his other hand over hers. The next morning, they loaded supplies into a borrowed wagon. Word had come from a homestead 2 valleys north. An older couple, the Bransons, had lost their roof to wind and needed help before the rains set in. Merritt offered to go. Delaney said nothing, just started packing flour and nails. They rode out before sunrise, the mountains still shadowed and blue. The trail was narrow and slick in places, but they made good time. At midday, they stopped by a stream to water the horses and eat. "You always look like you're listening to something," Delaney said, peeling a boiled egg. "I am." "What?" "Whatever's missing. It's like I'm waiting to hear something I lost a long time ago." She nodded, then set her food aside and waded into the stream. The water came up to her knees, and she tilted her head back to let the sun touch her face. Merritt watched her in silence, the way her body moved like she belonged to the land, not just passing through it. When she came back, her trousers soaked to the thigh, she said, "You look like you're afraid this'll end." "I am." She sat beside him, wringing out her cuffs. "Then we just won't let it." It was said without force, without promise. Just a fact. Like the sun would rise again and the creek would run cold in every season. When they reached the Branson place, they worked until their shoulders ached. Merritt shored up the beams while Delaney patched the chimney stack. They stayed 3 days, sleeping in the lean-to under a weathered tarp, waking each morning to the sound of wind in the junipers. On their last night there, Delaney curled beside him in the dark, her head on his chest. "If we built something," she said, "what would you want it to look like?" "A porch," he said. "Big enough for 2 chairs. Somewhere quiet." She was quiet a long time. "I think I'd like that." By the time they returned to Calver's Fork, the apple trees in the widow's orchard had begun to bloom. Merritt hitched the wagon in front of the jailhouse and reached to help Delaney down. She took his hand without hesitation, her eyes steady on his. "You're not afraid of me anymore," she said. "I never was. You were afraid of what I'd take with me if I left." He held her gaze. "And now I'm not." The wind stirred her hair, and she stepped into his arms, not as a guest, not as someone borrowed from the edge of his life, but as a woman who had chosen to stay. Inside, the lantern flickered to life. The map still lay folded on the desk, the trail lines waiting. But neither of them looked at them again. They had stopped running. The first warm rain came in the 3rd week of May, falling soft and steady through the twilight, soaking the earth until it smelled rich and alive. Merritt stood on the porch with his sleeves rolled past his elbows, watching the drops beat along the edge of the roof and fall into the trough below. Behind him, the jailhouse had gone quiet. Delaney was inside, sorting through a crate of ledger books she'd found in the storeroom, her voice occasionally rising in mild irritation whenever a page stuck or a mouse nest fell out. He didn't move until her footsteps crossed the floor. She stepped out behind him, barefoot, drying her hands on a rag. "I found a name in one of those," she said, nodding toward the crate. "A man I used to know. Didn't think I'd ever see it in ink." Merritt didn't press. She stood beside him and leaned forward slightly, letting the rain kiss her face. "I'm not afraid of ghosts," she said. "But it's strange when they come back as handwriting." He looked sideways at her. "You think he's still out there?" "No," she said. "He wouldn't have left anything behind if he was. He was the kind to burn his tracks." They listened to the rain for a long while. Calver's Fork was quiet in the wet hours, horses stabled, windows shuttered, smoke trailing low across the rooftops. "Do you miss anyone?" she asked softly. Merritt didn't answer right away. "My younger brother." He died in Tennessee. I hadn't seen him in years before the war started. When they sent word he'd been killed, I hadn't even known he'd enlisted." Delaney turned toward him. "What was he like?" "Faster than me. Braver than me. Thought the world owed him some kind of fairness." Merritt rubbed the back of his neck. He wasn't ready for what it gave him instead. Delaney stepped off the porch and into the yard, the rain matting her hair in dark waves. She turned to face him, her dress clinging to her knees. "Come down here," she said. "You'll catch cold." "I've lived through worse," she said, smiling. He hesitated, then joined her. The mud sucked at his boots and the water soaked through the shoulders of his shirt. Neither spoke. They stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body through the damp. "I used to think I'd never stay in one place long enough to see a season change," she said, watching the trees sway. "Now I hope summer comes slow." Merritt reached for her hand without thinking. Her fingers laced with his like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Things are going to shift," she murmured. "People will wonder why I'm still here, why I haven't been sent east or locked away. I'll deal with them. No. We'll deal with them." She touched his chest, just above the heart, and then leaned in to rest her forehead against his shoulder. Her breath was steady, her body solid against his. "Let me build something with you," she said. "Not out of fear. Not because we owe each other anything. Just because I want to." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her there in the rain, and something deep in him settled. The part that had always waited for the world to take away whatever good he found, the part that never trusted stillness, it quieted. "We'll start tomorrow," he said. "Whatever you want it to be." That night, they dried off by the fire, and Delaney pulled a cedar box from beneath the bed. Inside were scraps she'd carried for years, a rusted bullet mold, a piece of woven horsehair, a strip of red cloth with embroidery nearly worn away. "These are the things I kept," she said, "when everything else was taken." He reached into the box and lifted each piece without asking what it meant. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. He placed them back carefully, like they were sacred. "I want to make a place where you never have to keep things hidden," he said. She looked at him then, not with hope, but with certainty. "You already have." The next morning, they began clearing the small plot beside the jailhouse. Mrs. Albright came by with a parcel of seeds. One of the ranch hands from the South Ridge dropped off spare lumber. No one said anything obvious, but people lingered longer than usual when they passed. By the third day, the foundation for a new room had been laid, and Merritt caught himself humming as he worked. Delaney planted herbs along the edge of the porch, her hands covered in soil, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. That evening, as the sun dipped low and lit the valley gold, Merritt stood beside her at the edge of the garden bed. "Do you think you'll ever leave again?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked over at him, eyes shadowed with the past but brighter than he'd ever seen them. "I think I already did," she said, "and I'm not going back." He took her face in his hands then, kissed her with the kind of reverence that came only after long silence and shared labor. She kissed him back like the land itself had chosen this mercy for them, and they were only accepting it. Behind them, the chimney smoked steady. The porch was wide enough for 2 chairs, and the seeds had already taken root. The ridge behind the jailhouse caught the last of the evening sun, long rays of amber stretching across the new boards Merritt had just finished setting. Delaney stood on the ladder, hammering a slat into place, her braid tucked under a kerchief, arms steady with the rhythm of the work. Merritt held the wood in place from below, his back aching in the kind of way that felt earned. "You've got to lean on that last one," he said, glancing up. "I'm not aiming to impress the governor," Delaney replied, wedging the nail straight. "It'll hold." He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You always this sure of yourself?" "Only when I know what I'm doing." She climbed down, passing him the hammer. Her hands brushed his by accident and didn't pull back. They had been building the extra room for nearly 2 weeks. It would give them space for a bed that didn't have to be pulled out of the wall, space for quiet mornings without boots clanging on floorboards, space for something that felt like permanence. The town hadn't commented, not aloud, but folks had started waving first, and Mrs. Albright had left a quilt folded on their porch without a word. That night, Delaney sat at the kitchen table, sharpening a small knife with slow, even strokes. Merritt poured water from the kettle into 2 mugs, setting one beside her. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She gave the blade a final pass across the stone and set it down. "I used to only think about the next hour, next creek, next place I could sleep without fear. And now," she looked at him fully, "now I think about planting tobacco root before the ground turns hard again. I think about keeping chickens. I think about learning how to fix that stovepipe without cursing." He sat across from her. "I think about you in every tomorrow I've got left." She reached for his hand across the table, her fingers tracing the calluses on his palm. "You still carry the war with you." "Yes, I carry mine too. I know." She laced their fingers together. "But it's quieter now." Outside, the rain had turned to mist, and the clouds were thinning. Merritt stood and pulled her to her feet, guiding her toward the window. They watched the moon rise pale and full over the tips of the trees. He turned to her and said, "Marry me." Her breath caught and she didn't answer at once. Her hand stayed in his, her thumb brushing lightly across his wrist. "I never thought I'd be asked that," she said. "Not by someone who knows everything I've been. I'm not asking because of what you've been. I'm asking because of who you are now. Because I want to stand beside you, not in front of you." The silence stretched, not heavy, just full. "I don't want a ceremony," she said finally. "No preacher, no dress. I don't need one. But I want to promise something back. Not just say yes." Merritt nodded once. Delaney stepped closer. "Then I promise to stay. I promise to build this life with you, slow and honest. I promise not to run when things get quiet." He leaned in and kissed her, and she kissed him back with a certainty that hadn't existed in her before. It wasn't a burning kind of passion, but something deeper. Something rooted. They married the next morning in the wide field beyond the creek. Just the two of them and the sunrise. Merritt spoke plainly, Delaney did too. No borrowed words, no witnesses besides the birds and the breeze. After, they walked back barefoot, carrying their boots in hand, shoulders brushing. Merritt built a shelf above the hearth for her keepsake box. Delaney carved their initials into the porch beam, not because anyone needed to see them, but because it felt right. Through the summer, they planted beans, corn, and a row of sweet herbs. Delaney learned to make soap with tallow and lye, and Merritt rigged a rain barrel from an old barrel and roof tin. They argued occasionally about the chickens, mostly, but the fights never lasted. She would fix the door she'd slammed, and he would bring her a cup of coffee before sunrise the next day. In the fall, a traveling peddler with a dusty mule stopped in town. Delaney traded 2 jars of pickled carrots and a length of twine for a silver thimble and a half-used ledger. She used the back pages to keep track of what grew, what thrived, and what didn't. One evening, as the first frost curled the edges of the grass, Merritt came inside carrying a cedar box he'd built in the workshop. He set it down on the table and opened it. Inside lay a pair of moccasins, child-sized, stitched with care. Delaney touched the leather with reverence. "You knew before I did. I had a hunch." She laughed softly, the sound fuller than it had ever been. "You're going to be a good father." "I'll try." She looked up at him. "We're going to give them a home that doesn't have ghosts." He stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "We already are." Years passed. The walls they built held through storm and snow. Their child Jacob grew strong and curious, with his mother's steadiness and his father's quiet gaze. The townsfolk came to call the jailhouse the Harlan place, and though Merritt still wore the badge, fewer folks needed jailing with each season. Delaney taught Jacob to ride before he was 7, and Merritt taught him to read maps by firelight. They planted a second garden, then a third. They added a smokehouse and a narrow coop for hens. Sometimes Delaney would sit on the porch in the blue hours of dusk, watching her husband mend gear or teach their son to tie knots. She would rest her hand on her belly where another child stirred and think how far she'd come from the dust roads and broken fences of her past. Merritt always knew when she was remembering. He would come sit beside her, take her hand, and say nothing. They never spoke about what might have been, only what was, and what would come. In the end, that quiet life they built stood firmer than any courthouse or gallows. It was made from the small, enduring things. One board, one promise, one morning at a time. And they never left.